The recall effort that attracted national headlines in Jefferson County was successful this week as voters removed the 3-member conservative majority. Voters in Douglas County did not re-elect 3 conservative members, joining other counties in a major turning back on education reformers in Colorado. Patty, I think we knew where the tide was turning in JeffCo. It was going to be an uphill climb for that recall effort to not be successful. But I'm not sure if we really anticipated the wave, especially in Douglas County, where it didn't even look as big of a campaign as it did 2 years ago. What were your thoughts on the results from election night?
Well, certainly a year ago, we wouldn't have thought that education, and not necessarily education, but education entities were going to be the big issue in this election. That was just when the protests were starting over the new board and the history hullabaloo. The fascinating thing about JeffCo, which really was the most watched race in the country, unlike, say, Bennett versus Neville versus Blaha, that it was incredible how quickly the tides turned, much more than anyone anticipated, and it wasn't really because of the substance of what this board had or hadn't done. It was how the board had behaved. And that's the lesson that I think everyone needs to follow in Colorado if we want to put an end to the recall. It is behave like a grown-up once you're elected. You know, don't diss kids, students, if you're trying to teach a lesson to them. Don't diss their parents. Behave yourself. And that was really the story in JeffCo. The amazing thing in Douglas County, I hadn't heard about the board misbehaving. That maybe emphasized much more the sentiments out there, which is some of these reform fixes in education are not working, and we're going to throw everyone out again. So incredible stories in Colorado. And then in Denver, the Happy Haynes almost losing the school board. I think that was another one that had much less to do with education than people are tired of the old school the old guard coming back in. And in Happy's case, she also now is head of parks. And I think that was too much for a lot of Denverites. She barely squeaked in.
Amy, the Independence Institute was a major player in this, supporting a lot of the reform efforts. So a tough night over at the Institute, but how do you look at it now that we're a few days away from election night?
Well, if I gauged my emotions on every election, it'd be like, you know, gauging emotions on day trading. So we look at a long-term approach, and yes, reformers across the state lost. But let's look at the people who in Jefferson County who won. They won by embracing the policies of the prior reform board. So they won by saying, yeah, we agree with equal funding for charter schools. Are they going to now turn back that equal funding? How about raises, $21 million in raises for teachers? Or are they going to go back and say, listen, we're now going to build a school without any debt? So in the election, they actually embraced reform ideas. Now, if you were to go back to it, and this is where we take a long-term approach, 22 years ago was the Charter School Act, or almost 23 actually. If you had thought, I mean, and that was just right at that time, we're going to do something groundbreaking. 23 years later, charter schools would be the largest district in the state if it were its own district. The reform train has left the station. I don't think you're going to roll those back. Personalities will change, but people like the reform policies. To Patty's point, they don't like being disrespected. They just like the reform policies. And I think you're going to find that going forward. We may have a swing in elections, but I don't think you're going to roll back those reforms because people like them too much.
Mm-hmm. Pat, I think I agree with much of the sentence that's been said already, but I would add to it, not only do folks not be disrespected, but I think politically, it's when you play your hand too broadly, you played it too hard, and it's going to swing back. We've seen it politically in the legislature quite a bit, but I guess this was the first time we saw it on such a grand scale with school boards. Do you see, what's your take?
Several lessons here, and this is a topic we could devote a whole show to this, but I agree with what's been said, and I've said it before, particularly about the folks in JeffCo. Sometimes how you treat people is more important than what you do. And I think they started very early on, and at least they were consistently bad. They treated people poorly, they were disrespectful, they talked over people, and they didn't seem It's one thing to hear someone and disagree. It's another thing to act like you don't even care that they're in the room and they're speaking to you and expressing heartfelt concerns. And for better or for worse, that's how the JeffCo group was branded, cast, perceived, and now they're out. I don't like the use of the recall tool in this fashion. I didn't like it in the General Assembly, and I don't like it in the fashion it's been used now. If you vote, you ought to just take your medicine, if this is who you put in office, and ride them out and make another choice at the next election cycle. But that's not what folks decided to do in JeffCo. Douglas County is a little bit different because I think in Douglas County, I think the board members there were respectful, inclusive. I kept reading about all these community forums and community meetings they were having. I think the people just didn't agree with where they ended up, but something else happened. I think parents and kids and communities are becoming less and less patient with school districts. They want to see more rapid results, which goes to my third point. That's why I think Happy had such a hotly contested and close election against a guy no one ever heard of before, really, and she's the incumbent president of the Denver Public School Board. That tells you that even in a community that's considered more liberal and accepting, people are becoming less and less patient with K-12 policy. And finally, I think Amy's right when she talks about reform. The train has left the station, but I would submit that reform comprehensively is different than we're thinking about it now. I think in the minds of a lot of parents, K-12 education in America is a complete do-over. We need to blow it up and start all over, and it's not charters, it's not vouchers, it's a whole systemic change, you know, getting away from September to June, school calendar year, and all of these things. And I think we're going to see more and more of this percolate to the top.
Kira, obviously recalls, which before, I think a few years ago, had only been used very sparingly when you find an elected official committing huge, heinous crimes. Now is a political weapon. Because it's been used successfully twice, as that train left the station, are we going to see more recalls being used in other areas?
Well, I think so, yes. And, you know, actually what happened in Jefferson County is very reminiscent to me of what happened as far back as 2006 in El Paso County in Colorado Springs when recall through 3 of the 4 school board members who were pro-voucher, you know, out into the street. And you know, they too were also, those board members were incredibly disruptive. They were incredibly rude and attacked parents, attacked teachers, attacked other board members who didn't agree with them, and as a result they were, you know, recalled. And at the time it was, you know, a pretty high profile you know, situation in Colorado Springs. Hadn't really hit the rest of the state, but that trend I think certainly continued over and replayed itself in Jefferson County. I think that the use of recall certainly will continue, particularly when you've got such big money coming in from out of state, the PAC money, the 501c4 money, very difficult to track. And when you've got that kind of money, putting sometimes stealth candidates or slate candidates into office, what then, you know, comes to the board meetings and shows up, you know, may be a big surprise for a lot of voters who may not have seen it coming. And so then, you know, once that's realized, going back and removing those troublesome candidates or troublesome board members, elected officials, who may not believe in the basic concept of public education, probably will be a tool that's used again.